Hello watch enthusiasts! Now as January begins, we re-enter the season of large-scale watch releases. And of course this coincides with CHRONICLER in Geneva, where a very large number of pieces will be released in the next couple of weeks. But today I'd like to speak about the most interesting pieces over the past month, of those pieces released during this time, but also those pieces which are pre-SIHH tasters, if you will, from a number of very well-established brands. And this month we see a number of very interesting pieces from IWC, in addition to an interesting Perpetual calendar from Girard Perregaux, and of course a very interesting FP Journe as a result of the end of one of their most popular lines. And whilst this isn't a piece which features directly in this video, as it's not really of much interest to the vast majority of consumers due to its exclusivity and price, but I thought I just had to start the video with this very beautiful release in the form of the IWC Big Pilot Contant-Force Tourbillon Edition Le Petit Prince, which is this wonderful gold-cased piece with their very impressive Contant-Force escapement, and of course the tourbillon. The first piece I'd like to speak about, though, is another model from IWC, and this is the Pilot's Watch Timezoner Spitfire edition, the longest flight. And this piece is a play on a model which is previously has previously been seen in their line, which is the Timezoner. And previously this has been a chronograph, but in this form one has a simplified display, simply being used for a world timer and GMT function with of course the date and the time. And I think this is a wonderfully clean design, and a piece which I think is one of the most appealing designs in the current IWC lineup. And the general premise of this watch is a limited edition of 250 pieces, which celebrates the Silver Spitfire Longest Flight project, which intends to fly a restored Spitfire around the world, which is a very interesting project, especially considering IWC's aviation connections. And this piece comes in stainless steel, in a large but albeit familiar size to those who've worn an IWC Big Pilot, for example, of 46mm in diameter by 15.2mm thick. It also is water resistant, as is customary for these Pilot's watches from IWC. It's rated to 6 atmospheres, so 60 metres, and it's also negative pressure resistant, so it is usable in the cockpit of a plane. But it has a very interesting balance of modern functionality and technicality, with something which does have certain vintage elements and touches, which I think are very appealing, and I think will appeal to collectors, and also people who just want to wear a luxury pilot's watch. And elements which show really just how well conceived this watch is that integration of new and old, with a level of very fine brushing on the lugs, but with polished bevels, and also with that wonderful large onion crown, which is nicely edged and of course is stylised to have those flat sides for ease of use, but also for a slightly more crisp design to a traditional style of onion crown. But then one has the rotating bezel, which has an interesting functionality, but is topped with this black ceramic insert. And I think the appearance of this bezel gives the watch something which is somewhat similar to some of the military pilot's watches issued by Omega during the Second World War, and so it gives a very interesting aesthetic to this watch, albeit at a much larger scale. But this is also functionally very important, because it's directly connected to the movement, and this allows you to be able to move the main hour hand back and forth between time zones, and so one's able to get real functionality out of this, whilst also having the GMT function visible through that window on a wheel in the centre of the dial, moving IWC to the side. And I think the loss of the chronograph on this watch is a very welcome change, because it means you get this very crisp display, and this watch is very much a GMT and world time watch, instead of also having the chronograph functionality. And this allows the dial to have this very three-dimensional matte black form, with that different level for the minute track around the edge of the dial, and of course these large hands, which allow the slightly patinated style of luminova to be visible. And this gives the watch again another vintage sort of element, but I think it's very well executed and very tasteful. And powering this watch is the in-house caliber 82760, which has a 60-hour power reserve and also has certain ceramic parts for wear resistance, which is a rather interesting innovation. It also does have the famous Peloton winding system to give it automatic winding, and of course does have that very clear GMT functionality with the bezel, and also with the GMT display, with of course the date placed on this watch at the 3 o'clock position. And the price for this watch isn't fully finalised, but it's rated currently at €14,100. The second IWC I'd like to speak about is a model which comes from their Top Gun line, and it's the Pilot's Watch Double Chronograph Ceratanium, a piece which plays on the rattrapante chronographs which have been made by IWC for a number of years, and creates something which is genuinely novel in terms of combining technology to create a case material which really answers all the problems that one has with both ceramic cases and titanium cases alike. Before I speak about the case material, I'd like to speak about the general build of the watch altogether, because the piece is 44mm in diameter by 16.8mm thick, making it a certainly rather thick watch, although this is down to the complexity of the movement and its overall thickness. But the general appearance of this watch is very stealthy, and I suppose in that way is rather akin to the fighter planes that have inspired this line, because one has a matte black sort of finish to the case, in addition to some red elements on the second hand, but also on the rattrapant pusher on the opposite side of the case. And the general design of this watch is very much akin to previous IWC rattrapant chronographs, but certainly is designed to pay homage to the line, whilst also innovating in a new direction. I think the design of the dial very much demonstrates the fact that this watch is designed to both celebrate the lineage of this watch, but also very much propel it towards the future. And the rather dark treatment of the dial matches the case very well, with a matte black finish with these concentric rings on the subdials to differentiate them and make them a bit more reflective. Then one has this grey on black sort of coloration for the dial, in addition to those small red elements, but the detailing is very good, with a lowering of the level of the dial around that day-date window, in addition to this grey print on the dial, in addition to grey elements of luminova on the hands, for instance. And beating inside this watch is a movement which is perhaps a surprise for this price, because it's based on the Veltri 7750 and is called the 79230. But I think one should remember that IWC have been modifying the Veltri 7750 for many years now in terms of using it for these rattrapant chronographs, but also in their general range in terms of using it as a very reliable, extremely well-engineered movement. And this piece uses it to provide a rattrapant chronograph function, and so they have modified it in-house to give it this double second-hand chronograph configuration, whereby you use the pusher at the 10 o'clock position to split the seconds so that you can take a measurement before allowing the hand to rejoin the other. And so this creates a very interesting and very useful functionality for someone who wants to time several things at the same time, and this piece is certainly the sort of watch which would appeal to a pilot as a result of this additional functionality over a standard chronograph. But the case of this watch is perhaps the most interesting element, and IWC certainly aren't new to using composites and also ceramic, because they were an early adopter of ceramic on their watches. But this piece uses a new type of technology from the brand, which allows them to combine the lightweight and strength of titanium, so the tensile strength of titanium that is, with the hardness, the surface hardness of ceramic. And this allows the watch to enjoy the best of both worlds, in the sense that it's able to not shatter upon impact and be quite light, unlike ceramic, but unlike titanium, which scuffs and marks easily, it has a very hard surface. And so I think this is a very interesting innovation, and certainly they've garnished it with other features which are useful for a pilot, notably anti-magnetism thanks to a soft iron core, and also the fact that this watch is negative pressure resistant and water resistant to 60 metres, as is the standard for their pilot's watches. And the price for this piece is, again, yet to be determined exactly, but will be around €14,400. As a complete contrast to those very technical pilot's watches released by IWC, Cartier have revived an older line of theirs, which was in fact the second piece they released after the Santos. And this piece was released in 1906 and was the Tonneau. And this model has been revived several times in the 1990s and then in the 2000s to celebrate this piece. However, interestingly, they're remaking it in a very new form, and one which has changed somewhat, but keeps the key characteristics of the original. And they're releasing 4 new versions of this watch, 2 for a slightly more accessible area of their market, with a more traditional design, and then 2 for the high-horology range of extremely high-end pieces they now produce. Now, the first 2 pieces come in their Prive collection, and this is a more expensive sort of collection than the standard set from Cartier, and this does show in the design and the concept of these pieces. And these models are the Cartier Tonneau large hand-wound, and are 46mm in length by 26.2mm wide by 8.8mm thick, making them very interesting in terms of proportions, and still wearable thanks to having quite a short lug-to-lug by contrast to a lot of other watches. And of course, one has to remember these watches are entirely curved, and so one sees a curve right the way through their form, although the front and the back of the watch don't follow quite the same curve, and so one has a slightly more accentuated curve to the crystal on the front of the watch. And this creates a unique aesthetic and something which is so typical of Cartier, where they play with the shape of a timepiece. And predictably, being in Cartier's more high-end line, these pieces come either in pink gold or platinum. And the pieces themselves come with a very similar format, with those quite straight and quite short screwed lugs going out from the very extents of the case, and then one has these bevels running along the edge of the case and forming this sort of picture frame around the crystal and of course around the dial. Then one has a very typical Cartier crown with a cabochon on it, with the platinum having a ruby, and then the gold having a more standard sapphire, whilst the dial itself is an interesting piece because of this rather interesting shape, and so one has these stretched Roman numerals. But Cartier have certainly brought these pieces into the 21st century as a result of changing the dials somewhat from the original form. So where previously there were beautiful, rather pale white enamel dials, now these pieces have sunburst effect dials, where the platinum has a slightly colder grey tone, whilst a warmer tone is given to the gold version. One also sees a similar change to the applied Roman numerals, because these pieces are no longer painted on, but now are applied in metal to the surface of the dial, and are no longer blue. Instead they take on this silvery form to give the watch a far more modern aesthetic. In the hands, however, one finds a very traditional touch, with this blued metal colour, in addition to their form as these Breguet hands, which are modified to Cartier's needs with a more delicate hour hand, but certainly give an air of real elegance to this timepiece. In truth, there is really only one element of this watch which I find unremarkable, and that's the choice of movement. Because these pieces use the caliber 1917 MC, which is an in-house, manually wound movement with a 38-hour power reserve. But I feel that for the prices these watches are being sold for, which is $22,400 for the gold version and then $26,200 for the platinum version, I feel they could have extended something a bit more interesting, on the basis that for that sort of price, one can look at something like for example, a Breguet 7277 with its incredible 10Hz movement and very, very detailed case and dial. But nonetheless, to a Cartier collector, I can see why these would be very interesting, and of course the additional interest of the platinum version, which is limited to 100 pieces, I imagine will certainly sell these very quickly. The second range of pieces, though, released in the Tonneau line, certainly couldn't be accused of having a pedestrian movement, because this is the Cartier Tonneau Extra Large Skeleton Dual Time, and this takes a larger form at 52.4mm from lug to lug, 29.8mm wide, and then 11.9mm thick. And this piece follows on from previous versions of this watch which did feature dual time configurations. However, this is different in one key way. It uses a single movement for both functions, as opposed to previous versions which simply mounted two movements. And this piece features a beautifully polished case with a very similar design, and maintains all of the key design cues of the previous version I've spoken about. And this piece comes, as with the other version, in platinum or rose gold, with both being available for different prices, of course. And this is an interesting model in the sense that it takes what is a very traditional design and makes it very much a part of Cartier's high-horology line. Because one sees, of course, undeniably through the front of the watch, this skeletonized design where the dials, silvered, appear on the bridges and plates of the movement. And so one sees this very interesting display with, of course, the traditional blued hands giving you high legibility. And whilst the aesthetics of this watch are truly striking with its twin cabochon-topped crowns, it's really the design of the movement which is most impressive, and in some ways reminds me of some of the early JLC movements, produced such as the 101. They're incredibly small, in fact the smallest manually wound mechanical movement ever made. But this movement has one interesting characteristic and trait, which is inherent to the design of the watch. Because whereas with a standard three-hand watch, the movement can simply be placed in the middle of the case, and so doesn't need to be curved. However, if you have a movement which is extending right the way across the case, it has to curve, which is an inherent problem for a mechanical movement. And so to be able to function under this strange positioning, the movement's wheels and cogs have had to be beveled, and so they have to have their teeth placed at an angle on their edge, and so this means that the movement can actually be curved to fit into this case. And the movement's name is the 9919, which is an interesting movement as it still retains a 60-hour power reserve, despite this interesting technology to make it both slender, skeletonized, and of course this odd shape. It also runs at 4 Hz and has two independently set time zones, despite the fact they run off the same balance, which is quite an interesting piece of technology with the spring barrel, as you can see, at the 12 o'clock position and the balance at 6 o'clock, creating this very, very interesting aesthetic, and making this watch a really wonderful alternative to other Cartier models if you're looking at a high horology sort of range. And the price for this watch is certainly very, very high, and there are 100 pieces being made of each colour, with the gold version being $68,500 and the platinum $78,500. Now this next piece is a spin-off of a model which I found rather interesting when it was released a while back by Girard Perregaux, because this is the perpetual calendar version of the Laureato. And this watch was designed in its non-perpetual calendar form to be a competitor for other watches in that integrated bracelet steel sports watch sort of range. So these watches are pieces at the lower end, such as the Piaget Polo S, for example, and then at the higher end the Patek Philippe Nautilus, as well as the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak and the Vacheron Constantin Overseas. And I think this piece offers a very interesting product, and certainly in this new form, which is the perpetual calendar version, it really is an interesting option, because this piece is 42mm in diameter by 11.84mm thick. And I think the design of this watch is certainly not what one might call the most original, because it is true to say there are a lot of influences to this watch and a lot of elements which are comparable to other offerings from other brands, notably the dial with its tapisserie pattern or its hobnail pattern in the case of this piece is very similar to what you might immediately expect to see on an Audemars Royal Oak, and similarly one sees elements such as the octagonal bezel and also the general lines of the case which do appear to hark back to, for example, IWC Ingénieur models from the 1980s, as well as some models from Patek Philippe, as well as, of course, Audemars Piguet. But I think overall it's a very interesting piece from the perspective of design, because it is an appealing design and one which is perhaps a little bit softer and more varied in finishes than its competitors. But of course this version is steel but becomes a perpetual calendar, and the functionality of that perpetual calendar is interesting to say the least. But in terms of its other specifications, it does of course have this rather beautiful dial with this hobnail effect, in addition to having blued applied indices, and then of course the addition of these blued hands, and then that lighter second hand. And the dial is rather interesting also from its design whereby one has the placement of the different elements of that perpetual calendar in an asymmetrical sort of way. And I must say I think it works very well through the combination of white, red and blue. Because one sees predominantly blue on the dial, but there are red elements, such as the indicator for the month, which is placed at the 5 o'clock marker in red, which is quite an interesting touch and a double use of this particular index. And the display is also interesting from the perspective of having these eccentric subdials, so one has the date placed close to 2 o'clock, in addition to the day of the week being placed on that 9 o'clock side of the dial, and then one has the leap year indicator placed at 6 o'clock, giving this very interesting context to the idea of displaying perpetual calendar. And in many ways I find the case finishing just as interesting as the dial, as one has this rotary brushing on the bezel, in addition to this transverse brushing across the case and then down the flanks of it. One also has polished middle links on the bracelet, and this rather interesting unprotected crown with a similar motif of that octagonal shape as seen on the bezel. And really the only sign from the outside of the case there is a perpetual calendar is the pusher placed at the 8 o'clock marker. And the movement inside this watch is the caliber GP01800-0033, an in-house automatic movement which runs at 4 Hz and has a 54-hour power reserve, in addition to having 46 jewels, and of course a modular perpetual calendar. But what's interesting about this is that apart from that pusher which controls the day, the rest of this calendar can be controlled in both directions by the crown. And this is very helpful when one thinks that most perpetual calendars have to be controlled via a series of small pushers around the case, and also most of them won't go backwards, and so as a result if you overshoot the mark one has a lot of rearranging, or in the case of some perpetual calendars one actually has to send the watch back to the manufacturer to be reset, which creates an interesting problem really with some of these movements. But there are none of these with this particular movement because you can run it backwards, which I think is a clever and very helpful element to this timepiece. And whilst I wouldn't consider this watch a direct comparison to an AP Royal Oak or a Patek Philippe Nautilus, it does raise an interesting question if you're looking for functionality and a steel sports watch of that type. And the reason I say that is this watch retains 100 metre water resistance, but offers a perpetual calendar for a price of 34,500 Swiss francs, which is by no means a small amount of money. However, by comparison, the equivalent steel perpetual calendar Royal Oak is almost twice the price, and a Patek Philippe Nautilus with a perpetual calendar, albeit in white gold because a steel version isn't currently in the range, would cost almost 4 times the price of this watch. And so this does make one think about the value of this piece and what it's offering, which I think is a very interesting product and one really to consider in the new year. Now this final piece really had to be included in this video, because for 20 years FP Journe have been producing one very important model alongside some of their others in the collection. And for those who don't know FP Journe, they are a watchmaker which is a fascinating example of what can be achieved in the industry. Because their watches are some of the only in the world where one can have a wristwatch which is built in a very similar way and with very similar principles and philosophy to an 18th century pocket watch, which is a remarkable concept and really one for those who like something quirky. But the Resonance has now been produced for 20 years, and it's coming to the end of its lifespan. And so for this last year of production, a special run of these pieces, just for this year, is being produced with a few marked differences to previous versions. And before I speak about these versions, I think I should just give a quick run through of what makes the Resonance so interesting. And this watch uses 2 mechanically unconnected balance wheels to be able to make this watch more accurate. And this is done by using the phenomenon of resonance to be able to make them run together, and so increase the accuracy of the watch as a whole, which is a fascinating concept. But in the form of this particular watch, it allows one to have a very interesting display as well. Because this watch is produced in a 40 by 9mm thick case, which is a very classic size, and certainly anything smaller wouldn't really work with this style of subdial. And this piece, of course, has that typical style of FP Journe, with this slightly mechanical and somewhat steampunk form incorporated into a wonderfully classical design. And these pieces will come in two versions, either in red gold or in platinum, and they also have matching dials to their respective colour, with the red gold having this beautiful matted surface to its red gold dial, whilst the platinum version has the same finishing to its dial, except this time in white gold. And so one has two very different interpretations of the same design, although both are extremely charming, and certainly there's nothing gaudy or ostentatious about these designs and these pieces. But of course, on the dial one firstly notices the arrangement of the subdials, as well as that power reserve indicator at the top of the dial. And one has these characteristic blued FP Journe hands which taper to a point, but then each subdial represents a different time zone, because you're able to set a home time on the 24 hours on the left-hand side of the dial, and then your travel time or your local time on the opposite side via the crown. And interestingly, this is the difference between this and previous versions, because formerly they were both 12-hour subdials, whereas now one has 24 and 12, thus allowing you to be away from a certain time zone, but still be able to tell which half of the day you're in, which is a helpful feature, and an interesting one as well. And so as these operate independently, one also has two second hands, one under each of these subdials, which creates a very, very interesting aesthetic, especially since these subdials in their gearship pattern are screwed to the surface of the standard and rest of the dial, if you will. And this creates a very interesting layering and depth to the watch, and I think makes it truly unique in the industry. And whilst the design of the case is truly beautiful, with those drop-down lugs, that beautiful and extremely heavily extended convex bezel, in addition to that truly iconic FP Journe crown, the movement really is the pièce de résistance, which is the caliber 1499.3, a 40 jewel movement with two balance wheels connected to a single spring barrel, and of course one has a single crown operating both as well. And so these do give those two displays running at 3 Hz. But perhaps most wonderfully about the movement is the fact that it's made entirely out of solid red gold, which with its beautiful finishing creates quite an effect, and creates a really wonderful piece to look at, as indeed are all the movements produced by FP Journe. And I must say, I think as a send-off for this iconic timepiece, this really is a wonderful testament to its time, as something which is mechanically a little bit different to the standard, and also something which isn't necessarily a limited run, but rather simply runs for 2019. And the pricing will be $78,200 for the red gold, and $82,200 for the platinum version. And with this beautiful FP Journe, I will finish the video. But do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of the video, and indeed which of these watches was your favourite. And so if you did enjoy the video, then do please like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more content and videos here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, out.